Hi everyone from Austin, Texas. Um, this is now how I imagine my first presentation in English, um, but these are unusual times to say the least. So let us dive straight in. All right. During the late 1930s, a group of middle to upper class Egyptians, among them politicians, state clerks, journalists, and writers, engaged in a lively public debate revolving around what seemed to be an emerging local food crisis. The different contributors, who fear that Egypt is to face a hunger similar to the one it experienced during World War I, concentrated on the government's responsibility to invest in producing more food, encourage the local consumption of local products, create a more just food distribution mechanism to fight the chronic malnourishment among the peasants, monitor and regulate local food production, and educate the peasants about new cultivation technologies and healthier and more productive nutritional lifestyle. This discourse was an intellectual shift in the way Egyptians thought about the role of the state with regards to food, as well as the various political, economic, and social meanings food carried with it. While debating on the various methods by which state should carry its new responsibility, they all agreed that the state should regulate different aspects of the food market to benefit the entire population. By the end of the decade, words became reality, with the establishment of the Egyptian Ministry of Social Affairs, which attempted to cope with the various social problems, food supply included. While its operation decreased dramatically during World War II, it resumed action after the war and still operates in Egypt today, along with other government offices and agencies, all responsible for one of the most complex and expensive food subsidy systems in the world. Egyptian food discourse of the 1930s was not a unique phenomenon. In other places around the world, in the US, the Soviet Union, and large parts of Europe, the public discussion regarding food and its political and social meanings increased dramatically and was accompanied by a widespread government's activity in supplying food for local consumers, many of them still suffering the results of the global depression of the early 1930s. Yet Egypt was not a part of this global trend, so to speak, mainly because it was seen as an underdeveloped, still semi-colonized country. When, in 1937, F. G. Boudreau, the appointed executive director of the Milbank Memorial Fund, argued that the world was in the midst of a campaign for better nutrition, he thought about breadlines in Brooklyn and nutritional discoveries in the labs of Oxford, not about Egyptian intellectuals in the cafes of Cairo. So, why talk about the Egyptian food discourse of the 1930s? I'll argue today that Egypt is a great case study for two meaningful social phenomena. First is the creation of a food discourse, wherein at a certain point, people begin talking about food, its production, distribution, and its various political and social meanings. Second is the identification of the state as the social and political agency responsible for regulating food markets, as opposed to the liberal perception that glorifies the free market. Examining this specific discourse is relatively easy because it started, as we'll see, in 1936, reached its peak in 1938, and then suddenly stopped with the outbreak of the war. By examining the historical roots of the three fundamentals of the Egyptian food discourse, food, state, and people, I hope to demonstrate how the Egyptian case can help us think not only of the history of public debates about food, but of some of our contemporary challenges. So let us talk about food first. During the 1930s, Egyptians began thinking and talking about food for two reasons. First, they thought they were in the midst of a food crisis, and second, the social and economic meanings of food itself changed. As for the food crisis, put it shortly, the harsh years of the global depression, in which many of the country's population suffered from food shortage, as well as Egypt's constant population growth rates, led many Egyptian thinkers and clerics to believe that a food crisis, similar to the one that swept the entire Middle East during World War I, is only a question of time. Knowing what we know today, it seems that, at least in theory, Egypt produced more food during those years, even when considering the population growth rates. It seems that Egyptian fears were based on partial information, but even if eventually they feared a catastrophe that never arrived, it was fear itself that pushed them to suddenly think of food and its relation to society. A more interesting aspect of the sudden interest in food was the changing perception with regard to what food is. During the 1920s, debates about food production and supply were rare, mostly because Egypt did not experience any major food shortage. Those who did talk about food thought of it as a purely physical need, concentrating on the notion of the calorie, discovered by Wilbur Atwater in 1896. J.I. Craig, the head of the statistics department in the Egyptian Ministry of Economy, wrote in 1927 that the human body is a machine, and like any machine, it needs energy. So for many Egyptians, food was fuel, and they reduced the potential danger of a food crisis to a mathematical problem: how to provide X number of calories to Y number of people. The change in this perception came during the global depression, which exposed two problems. First, it led to a near collapse of the local economy and weakened the consumption power of almost every Egyptian. Second, Egypt's population, as I said before, kept growing despite the economic hardship, averaging 13% growth every decade. Soon, it was clear that the two problems were interconnected. Without guaranteeing adequate food supply for the poor people, and especially the peasants, Egypt is doomed to remain an underdeveloped country. One example for this perception we can identify in the writing of Miri Boutros-Ghali, one of the leading figures of the Egyptian food discourse and the uncle of the future UN Secretary Boutros-Ghali, who wrote in 1938 that poor nutrition weakens the health and activity of the people and exposes them to sinister physical and spiritual danger. He argued that future policy should focus on securing the peasantry some measures of prosperity and some important improvement to their diet. So providing enough food was meant to stimulate economic activity and allow the peasants to grow more food, which in return will stimulate the economy and so forth. Food supply turned from a mathematical problem to a possible social solution allowing prosperity, higher living standards, and even social mobility. But who's to say that the state needs to supply this food? To understand how the state became the political entity responsible for regulating food, a short review of Egyptian history is needed. In 1882, British forces invaded Egypt, back then a semi-independent province of the Ottoman Empire. The formal reason for the invasion was to make sure the local government pays its debt to European creditors. But while the British invaded because of the Egyptian debt, they stayed for the Egyptian cotton, important source material for British textile mills. During the late 19th and early 20th century, they promoted several economic reforms aimed to increase local cotton production. These reforms are relevant to the current discussion because of three reasons. First, they shifted resources to cotton production, which led to decrease in local food production. Second, because of the new crop rotation and irrigation methods, the local peasants were forced to substitute wheat cultivation with maize cultivation, and staple consumption in rural areas changed dramatically as a result. Third, and for me the most important aspect of British intervention, is that the British promoted a liberal economic perception of minimal state intervention in the economy. These ideas kept shaping Egyptian economy throughout, these ideas kept shaping Egyptian economic thought even after the state gained independence in 1922, so that throughout the 1920s, the Egyptian bureaucracy avoided, almost religiously, from regulating different markets, food included. So how did we move from minimal intervention during the 1920s to state responsibility during the late 1930s? During the early 1930s, two political movements pushed for greater state intervention. The first was led by the new Prime Minister Ismail Sibki, elected in 1930s and as the head of the Ittihad party. Sidki was an advocate of the strong state and promoted state-led industry, partly to create an alternative source for income after the collapse of the agricultural sector during the global depression. He was also fond of regulation and intervention. Like some of his contemporaries, Mussolini of Italy and Ataturk of Turkey, Sidki's effort to centralize the Egyptian state were accompanied by a sense of authoritarianism. Along with the economic policies he promoted, Sidki replaced the 1922 constitution with a new one, giving him, surprisingly enough, greater jurisdictions. During the Depression years, the Egyptian government, or at least its prime minister, was on board of the state intervention train. Surprisingly, the political opposition to Sidki's rule was on board too. In light of the global depression, they too understood the virtue of a stronger, more centralized state, but wanted to do that without Sidki's fascist vibe. In 1936, Mustafa Nahas of the Wafd party, by far the most popular party in Egypt, won the election and restored a sense of political freedom. In August, he signed a new trade agreement with the British government, which gave Egypt further freedom in managing its internal affairs. Egyptian intellectuals and middle class, who up until that point were mostly preoccupied with questions of independence and sovereignty, could spend more time thinking about social issues. By this point, the political scene was ready to talk about regulation and economic intervention, again, from both the government side and from the political opposition side. When it came to food, the state was to regulate various aspects of food. It was supposed to regulate actual food production, to create more efficient food distribution mechanisms, to monitor nutritional deficiencies among the weaker parts of the society, to build soup kitchens and school lunch programs for the poorest of the poor, and to educate the peasants about the proper and modern cultivation methods that would ensure maximum food production. So, by the late 1930s, food carried a social meaning and was seen as a tool for social change, and at the same time, people expected the state to step forward and make this change possible. The last piece of the puzzle is the question of who is to benefit from those policies. So let us talk about Egyptian people, and more specifically, Egyptian peasants. As I mentioned before, Egypt's population grew rapidly along the 20th century. Roughly 87% of Egypt's 16 million citizens documented in the 1937 census lived in rural areas, making their living mostly from agriculture. For the educated middle-class urban strata, the Egyptian peasant, the falah in Arabic, stood at the heart of the new thought discourse. On the one hand, the falah underdeveloped, undereducated, dirty, and poor, was seen as the reason for Egypt's inferiority with comparison to the West. Henry Habib's Ayarut's book from 1938, The Fellaheen, presented the most notorious description of the rural population, calling them paralyzed and powerless, often blaming them for Egyptian inferiority in comparison to European states. While Ayarut's descriptions were since revoked as representing mainly an Orientalist perception of the East, it is without a doubt that when clerks and politicians in Cairo and Alexandria talked about food as a tool for economic development, it was the Egyptian fallah, the peasant, that they wanted to feed. At the same time, the fallaheen were seen not only as the cause for the nation's problem, but also as an opportunity for a better future. In 1937, for example, a gentleman named Hamid Said Azmi from the Statistical Department of the Ministry of Finance wrote that the government should give the fallah a fair chance to benefit himself materially and in turn improve and develop the wealth of the country. Another gentleman named Kamal Hilal wrote that same year that the state needs to educate the fallaheen and teach them the best agriculture ways to increase production. The fallaheen, the peasants, were seen as both the problem and the solution for Egypt's food problem, a paradox not unique to Egyptian society. For those engaged in the food discourse, the road to success, to modernity, began in the streets of Cairo and on its way to Paris went through the villages of the Egyptian Delta. So let us conclude. As I try to show today, the Egyptian food discourse was the result of several economic, social, and political trajectories coinciding in a special moment in history. The social mechanism by which food supply, subsidy, and production becomes a national issue has strong historical roots worthy of scholars' attention. Furthermore, the dilemmas and challenges Egyptians faced during the late 1930s, inadequate supply, unjust distribution patterns, chronic malnourishment among parts of the population, and social injustice expressed via food still prevails today in many parts of the world. With the current crisis threatening to deepen food-related problems for many, it seems that the question, what to do with a hungry peasant, remained unfortunately relevant. Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity and stay safe out there.